Thank you for this invitation again. I'm very happy to be here again. It is now the last week of the semester in Argentina, and I believe, what's your name, please? Melanie.
Mila.
Mila. Am I right that this is your last week here as well? Yes, in class. They also have exams and anxieties after Friday. But here's the difference between them, my students, and you, the students of one of those two there. Now we might be lost about who is the one, right? The difference is at home, the administration has decided to go on Zoom, to go remotely in the last week of the semester. Why? Because they want to be nice to the students. Instead, this is the real thing. You're here with me. But let me tell you how it goes there. This is how it goes when we start the semester. I say, guys, I'm here to try to teach you a few things. Like to you, we'll be together for a few minutes. And in order to teach you a few things, I must entertain you, I said. Now, to entertain you, it is impossible for me to compete with your screens, I go on. So, as if I were a beggar, I kindly asked them to get rid of them so that at least I have a small chance of entertaining, like trying to make eye contact without my hopes being deteriorated by anything interesting that might pop up in that screen. Exactly. Thank you very much. Since we're going to be together for so little, and since I may otherwise attack the way I did Mary Grace, I think we're much better off now. I'll let you know that I need you and that I'm harmless. Well, you heard so much about Finnis, haven't you? Let me tell you an entertaining thing about him that will give you the extent of the devotion of the person who will likely grade your papers in a few weeks. He bought, that is one of those two, a copy of the book Natural Law and Natural Rights for every single member of the faculty of this law school. Because Finnis was going to come here to give a great lecture. Do you know this story? Of course you don't, but I will tell you. Everyone was ready in the courtroom of this magnificent law school, wherever it was 35 years ago, the courtroom, probably not that one. They are all waiting with their book, ready to listen to the great man and then maybe ask him to sign their copy. But Professor Finnis was nowhere to be seen. No cell phones then, so I don't know how, but Professor Ambrosio, a term that could apply to both of them because they're both Ambrosios, not Ambroses, but Ambrosios, and one is professor of law and the other one is professor of life. So they're both Professor Ambrosios, Anthony and Michael. He somewhat got hold of the great man who had to fly from Chicago to New York, but instead flew from Chicago to, was it Dallas? Houston. To Houston. Now, his gate, he told me when I shared this anecdote with him recently, he tried to, plead innocent, and he said his gate was changed last minute in O'Hare. And it seems that in those days, they can let you in an airplane which is not your airplane. And you can even sit in a seat that is not yours, although it says 13D. but no one was in 13D that day. So Finnis is departing for Houston, and because he has a great sense of orientation, he saw the way the sun went, and he thought, I'm not flying to New York. This is going somewhere else. And in the meantime, people were waiting for him here. That's the man. That's the man. Yeah. Let me also tell you how Professor Ambrosio, the legit, and I met. We met through the great man. I was having breakfast with a professor of tax law at this law school, and I dropped the name Finnis in my conversation. I said that I had studied under him in Oxford, and this tax law professor said, then you must meet my colleague Ambrosio, who is a devout fan. So much so that he had bought copies of his own dying for everyone some years before this happened. So it was the name Finnis who put us in touch through this colleague who has now retired, John Coverley. You need to think, I think, now that you may think, because you're looking at me. I'm not saying that you will, but you may. If you're not looking at me, you mayn't. It's so difficult when you're otherwise distracted. I would be the first one to be otherwise distracted. I would watch entire movies, not just check my email or NDA results. You need to think about three different things having to do with natural law. One is the thing, natural law, what it is. The other one is the name, natural law. The thing may exist without the name and existed for many, many centuries without the name. The actual reality of natural law is all part of it. I just wanted you to look in that direction again without feeling guilty. Now that we could look, because there was some sound like that. Thank you. And thirdly, the study of the reality, what some people pretentiously call the science of natural law. The thing, the name, the thing that can exist without the name, and the study. You can also study the thing without the name, but typically the study of natural law and of everything that receives a name, typically the study follows the name, typically. So with the thing, as you know, the first references to the idea that there is a non-written normativity that tells apart good and just human arrangements, laws, customs from unfair ones. We find this first in pre-Christian writers, very famously in the play Antigone by Sophocles, that you will find referenced in every single text on natural law. There is never the word natural law there, but this girl or this young woman wants to bury her brother who had been a traitor, and therefore there is a law forbidding the burial of a traitor. She decides to breach the law, go ahead and bury him, no matter the consequences. Consequences were capital punishment. She decides to go for it because she says there is a higher law. She never says natural law. In fact, she refers to something that is not human law, but it's more like a lower law. Does anyone know how she calls this unwritten law?
What you said was the laws of the gods.
Yes, the laws of the gods, but in particular of one god that features in Percy Jackson and the Olympians, among many other movies. Does anyone know the name of this guy with the letter H?
Hades.
Hades, a really bad guy with horns and, fire. Yes, he is one of the gods of the underworld, like in the movie, the Lycans, remember? Lucian, for those who are into those dark movies. Well, she says these laws of Hades are more important than the laws of Thebes, her city, that had been enacted. Do you know by whom? Anyone? Creon, who was what to this girl?
Her uncle.
Her uncle, like Professor Ambrosio and Fiona. Yes, the uncle was really happy with one of Antigone's brothers, who was a legend, as you'd have it in the movies. And then very unhappy with the other nephew, and then said, no burial, Antigone defied. And the reason she gave is a reason we could call a natural law reason, based on an unwritten rule that was received by her conscience that told her, I ought to do this, even though the written law says I ought to not do this. A second, way more boring pagan reference to natural law without name is also very famous, and it's by Cicero, who describes an unwritten law that has a spatial universality and a temporal universality. He says this unwritten law is the same in Rome, in Athens, in Sparta, and was the same 1,000 years ago, now, and in the future. Now, when Cicero says this, he doesn't mean that in the past or in the future there was no murder. No, he wasn't an innocent fool. What he's saying is murder was wrong then, now, and in the future, even though there was murder then, now, and in the future. Murder is wrong here, there, and there, even though there is murder here, there. So these natural law claims, which were done not under the name natural law, are normative and not sociological claims. Because otherwise it would be very easy to dismiss them and say, wait a minute, how can you say it's against, slavery is against natural law? There was slavery for centuries, and you're saying this is universal. Well, of course, but the universality is about what ought to have been, not about what it was. By the way, in case you are interested, and I must say, luckily that you seem interested, I've written a very long article on this that I will send you to your professors that was published in the Louisiana Law Review a few years ago. Now, that's the reality of natural law. What else about the reality without the name? St. Paul to the Romans. This man, one of the first converts, he was a Jew, as you know, he had a vision. Some people say he fell from a horse, but we're not sure about the horse, although it's in all the paintings by Caravaggio and so on. The Bible doesn't say anything about the horse. He has a vision, he becomes a believer in Christ, and he writes zillions of letters. A very famous one is to the Romans, where he makes the perfect natural law argument, although he never mentions natural law because the term hadn't been coined yet. But the reality, of course, I showed you already, was always there, this duality between an unwritten normativity with evaluative claims, moral claims, and positive written normativity or law, written or like custom, maybe unwritten. So what he says is that in order to know what is right, the Jews have a written law. Do you know, Mary Grace, what this written law is?
Torah.
The Torah. And in particular, within the Torah, what would be more relevant to know what we ought to do? Anyone else? Two? Two what? The 10 Commandments written in 2 tablets, some in the first tablet, some in the second, written by Moses, who was said to be the finger of God. So written by God through the finger of this man. Now, Paul was a Jew. He knows that the Jewish people could know that lying is wrong because there is a commandment that says, thou shalt not lie, and so on and so forth. But he says, what about the pagans who, by definition, they had not received this privilege that the Jewish people have received of knowing for a fact in written form that they ought not to take their neighbor's wife, and so on. Well, he said, the pagans still know that they shouldn't do it. Now, both the Jews and the pagans, maybe they do it. Now we go again to the sociological domain. That's irrelevant for Paul's claim. Paul's point is, how is it possible that if you're not a Jew, you may still know that stealing is wrong? It must be, he says, because it is written on their hearts. Of course, not literally written. What he means is they may know in their conscience that they shouldn't kill, even if it's in their benefit and so on. So here enters again this idea that there is an unwritten moral law. This unwritten moral law that some centuries later became natural law in the writings of a saint of a Catholic church who was mentioned today by one of the Ambrosios. Who is this? This is also practice for the exam. Not Donald Trump, yes?
Aquinas.
Aquinas. Aquinas, who is Aquinas? Doesn't have a name. Aquinas is a place. Thomas Aquinas, although your professor said Saint Thomas Aquinas, because indeed this gentleman from a small town called Aquinas, therefore Thomas of Aquinas, Tommaso d'Aquino, he was canonized, made a saint by the Catholic Church at some point. So St. Thomas Aquinas, some people say, was the first person to talk systematically about natural law, second aspect, first the thing, second the name, and to study systematically natural law, third thing, the study, the science. Of course, he relied on the likes of St. Augustine, who wrote more or less 800 years before. We owe Augustine a very famous phrase to which Professor Finnis devotes the entire 12th chapter of the book you are supposed to reread, which is to assume that you have read. Would I? Just kidding. This phrase is lex injusta non est lex, sed magis corruptio legit, all of which you can read in my article. Rest in peace. An unjust law is not a law, but rather the corruption of a law. Now, many think wrongly, as Finnis explains, that this summarizes the idea of natural law. It doesn't. It's very important for natural law, but as we will see, there is way more to natural law than this idea that supposedly an unjust law is not a law. The only reason I mention it at this point, I won't say at this early point, because don't worry, we are you already passed like half of my attention span and maybe yours, or how do we call it? Bathroom span. Maybe that's for the elderly like me. Although the students also like to think they have a bathroom span because it's like a perfect excuse to stand and look at the professor with kindness and go to make a phone call or something and then come back from the alleged bathroom. Anyway, I go Augustine, not much talk of natural law there, but the idea that human laws may be judged in the light of a different type of normativity, not positive, but moral. Because if you say that an unjust law is not a law, what does make a law unjust? Surely it cannot be the law itself, because the law says this is what it is. So the idea is there, and then Thomas takes this idea and in his monumental 10-volume or 13-volume work, Summa Theologiae, Handbook of Theology, he spends maybe 150 pages on what is natural law, how does it connect to religion, how does it connect to positive law, how does it connect to the laws of science. All of this is carefully discussed by Thomas Aquinas, so you could say that from there onwards, many philosophers, theologians, lawyers became part of a school of thought that we can call natural law theory. That school of thought, of course, is not the reality of natural law, which existed before this school of thought existed, but it started to deepen the understanding of what is owed to morality. What are the limits of human law? How and when does human law make sense? When you're allowed to criticize it? When are you allowed to disobey, morally allowed to disobey a human rule? These are the discussions. Now the discussions thicken and thicken and thicken, and by the 18th century, you have a new model of study of natural law that most people agree is a decadent model, very far from the original notion. And this new model is one where natural law, understood the way it was then, completely replaces human law because it's a perfect, complete system of law that regulates property, marriage, torts, you name it. This is sometimes known in the United States as natural law jurisprudence, and it is called that in a pejorative, critical, derisory fashion. So when during the Lochner era, the Supreme Court struck down several regulations on economic matters, wage, salaries, housing, rent, markets, invoking substantive due process, the criticism by the dissenters was, this is rationalistic natural law we have here. It's ideology, this rationalistic way of understanding natural law. And in my view, it was rightly criticized. But at the same time, something very unfortunate happened, which was that now people forgot about what we would call the original natural law. And so now it would become difficult to defend natural law without being labeled a rationalist or a libertarian, because those justices, as you know, were free market types when they were alleging natural law, which is very ironic. It's one of the important tenets of natural law, rightly understood, is social justice. Well, this is how we get to the work of a professor at Harvard Law School in the 1950s and 60s, who wrote a book called The Morality of Law. This is Professor Lon Fuller. Now, Fuller noticed that the positivistic reaction against natural law jurisprudence had a lot to be said for, because the positivist view made a lot more sense than that natural law, especially from the perspective of the law school. Things had become unmanageable. It was impossible to know what the law was if you're going to adopt a jurisprudence that is based on an unwritten law that regulates everything. Who tells you what that unwritten law is that regulates everything? At the same time, Fuller didn't want to fully embrace positivism, and he was struggling to recover, so to speak, the good natural law when he wrote this book that was published, I think, in 1960 or 61. At that time, he invited a professor from the University of Oxford, H.L.A. Hart, the great master of the new positivism in the English-speaking world, to come over to Harvard to debate him. And several articles were published in the Harvard Law Review on the separation of law and morals that reflect the debate between these two titans. One who was trying to resurrect the natural law tradition with difficulty, and the other one who was trying to kill it forever. Now, at that time in Oxford, there was a young man, newly arrived from Australia, who was writing a doctorate with Hart. And this young man was no less than John Mitchell Finnis. In fact, Professor Finnis told me that Hart one day summoned him to his rooms. That's how they call in plural the office of a professor in Oxford, the rooms of a professor. And he said, Mr. Finnis, tomorrow I'm flying to America, where I'm going to debate the author of this book, and gave Finnis a copy of The Morality of Law by Lon Fuller. And he said, I need you to read this book tonight and meet me here tomorrow morning so that you give me a brief summary of the book as I'm going to debate. You know, this is classic when they ask someone young to do the hard work and then the other person takes all the credit. We're used to that. Although I think that in the airplane, Hart must have his own reading. It's like the rereading thing, maybe. Anyways, so Finnis became very aware of Fuller's work, and he was now starting to write natural law, natural rights. And in natural law and natural rights, you will notice that Finnis engages Fuller's work. Now, Fuller, in his work, he was saying that natural law theory needed a reorientation. Clearly, he didn't seem up to the task of doing himself this reorientation, but it's like a cry for help. And it would seem that on the other side of the ocean, someone heard and decided to answer the summons. And this is how we have this magnificent book that has fascinated your professor and me. I read it in my last year of law school, and I really understood very well 5% of it. I felt I was really lucky. I hope you'll get there. And maybe that 5% will be chapter 5 on the requirements of practical reasons. In my case, the chapter I understood was chapter 10 on law. The rest I didn't understand, but then I read it later, another time, and then another time. But you don't need to do that. I loved to do it, and then I went to Oxford to study with the man and write a dissertation, and as your professor said, I'm honored to know that we are friends. This book, you know all about it, so I won't say anything, but that Fuller's prayers were heard, and now we had a reorientation where natural law is no longer this rationalistic thing, but it's a limited attempt to check the boundaries of positive law with a view to evaluating, offering tools to tell apart just from unjust enactments, and offer a sound reasoning about how to go about unjust enactments, so that it won't be the case that anyone who thinks, no, this tax law is unfair, I'm not paying, I'm justified by natural law. No, wait a minute. Here, he distinguishes 4 different scenarios for unjust laws about what we ought to do in the face of it, and then he distinguishes the citizen, the judge, the public official who will be affected by an unjust enactment. Now, the other thing for which it's useful is for the interpretation. Natural law is useful for the interpretation of positive law, especially some branches of positive law, such as family law, criminal law, the Bill of Rights part of constitutional law. When you want to think about what is cruel and unusual, say under the Eighth Amendment clause, for example, natural law will chip in. Of course, after this book came out, many critics came into the scene, and one of them wrote a PhD thesis in 1987. The book came out, as you know, in 1980. In 1987, one of the critics wrote his PhD dissertation to criticize, and he titled this dissertation, defended and written at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, The New Natural Law, a Critique. This is by now Professor Russell Hittinger. Again, you'll find about this in my article. He basically said, this is all very well, but Finnis, in trying to save the tradition, has resorted to Kant, to a philosopher that is opposed to the tradition. He has also sold Thomism to the philosophy of David Hume. These are the statements by Russell Hittinger and then by several others who think that there is an old natural law theory and a new natural law theory. And the old is very okay. This is Thomas Aquinas, and the new is treason. Now, I'll leave it for yourselves to judge if you're interested, for the unlikely event that you're interested in judging in this contest. But I will tell you that I was at a conference last week. So I came last week from Argentina, and I'm flying back tomorrow. And in Notre Dame, I was at a conference where there was a presentation on the so-called new natural law theory. And the author, who has a new book on the topic, was describing the philosophy of Finnis. And the way she did it, I had a very hard time distinguish what Thomas Aquinas says and what Finnis says, because they say more or less the same. Except that these critics I mentioned earlier, they claim that they don't say the same. As I say, you have to judge for yourself. So let me show you that I got to the last page of my handwritten notes. It's proof which means we're about to come to the most exciting part of our meeting, which is when we converse. In other words, when I start calling each one of you, which is why I have this here, and I offer you some extra participation points for your paper if you manage to prove that you've been with me. Am I allowed to do that? I am. Good, good. Now, because I'm allowed, now I maybe will decide I will not. But if I'm not allowed, there's nothing I can decide. Well, you heard today about God of all people in a classroom. You don't hear much about God in a classroom. You heard about God and natural law. And of course, one of the main criticisms of those who criticize new natural law is they say, where is God in Finnis's work? It's an appendix. In fact, in the original version of the book, it wasn't chapter 10. It was an appendix. Because Hart, who edited the collection where the book was published, he said, no, I don't want a chapter on God here. Just put it in an appendix, remove it from the book. But in the last minute, Hart was old and Finnis was young, so he managed to squeeze it as chapter 10. Well, the critics say this is not enough. This is not enough. God has to be all over the place. And I think the criticism is unfair in that, of course, for Finnis, Aquinas' definition of natural law stands. What is natural law for Aquinas? We know the guy who really coined the term in a way. Well, it's the participation of us, of human agents, in what he calls eternal law, the plan of God for the universe, for the planets, for the rocks, for the plants, for the animals. Our conscious and free participation in that, I call, he says, natural law. So it's impossible to fully understand natural law without a reference to the creator of natural law. That is certainly true. But Finnis's point, which confused the critics, is that you don't need to think about that when you're about to decide if to torture a person is right or wrong. You don't need to think about the creator of that unwritten rule that says you should never torture someone. You will just know it without thinking whether God exists, doesn't exist, whether he created this rule, he didn't create it, even if he exists. You don't think, you just know it by virtue, said Professor Michael, of evidence. It becomes evident to your reason that torturing is wrong, and so on and so forth. Of course, some moral rules are not evident. If someone forgets, say, that phone here, and we all leave, and someone comes in and really needs the phone to sell it and make some money to feed this person's 13 kids, you may think that the person did the wrong thing by taking the phone and not reporting, or maybe you'll have some doubts. Was it really wrong? I mean, what is this phone to the owner? But to this person, imagine the person is so poor and has 13 kids. What am I saying? I'm saying it's not evident. It's not evident. In fact, most of our ethical dilemmas do not have an evident solution to them. But natural law provides you of some evident starting points. You ought to do good, you ought not to do what is wrong, and so on and so forth. That's the idea. And in order to know that, you don't need to have a clear mind about the creator. You don't need to. You have it. You are a religious person. You're a believer. All the better. Then your ways of knowledge of what is morally right will hopefully help each other and align, unless, of course, yours is a religion that teaches you things that are contrary to the natural law, which is something that should never be overruled, as sometimes, sadly, this happens. So I will stop here. I will open the floor to questions, which likely and sadly means, and I will say it as a provocation, that the brother of your professor perhaps will ask me a question. As I thank you very much for your attention, which I certainly don't take for granted, especially as I have such able competitors in your computers.
Thank you, sir, because you really gave our students a very good summary of where we are during this course. You definitely played, and I think it makes it memorable, especially your distinction between new natural law and John Finnis is something we didn't discuss. I think I mentioned it last time. Because it's essentially the idea that major criticism was that it's natural law without God.
Right.
Of course, this chapter 12, 13, could be clear that it's not just natural law comes from God. Indeed, he talks about the eternal law's participation is the natural laws. And so it's connected to eternal law and natural law is very, very direct. So the positive law ultimately is subject to being more critique that you try out. It's not even the limits positive law. More than, which is perhaps the best thing we have. Natural law puts constraints on what you can do by way of legislation or any action goes together. Thanks again.
Oh, you're welcome. You see how my prediction just came true, and the brother of your professor just asked the first question. Well, memorable. I really hope you're right. I'm very grateful. It is my informed and audacious view that the only way to do memorable things in the classroom is to try to make people laugh, and maybe they will remember. In the olden days, there was another way of doing memorable, which is to make people cry. That one has been ruled out but you see, they were made cry many times, which is why now they can laugh. Right, so we stay with the likely situation where the students don't ask questions because they speculate that perhaps if this is it, we're going earlier for lunch, or someone will make the class look nice, and then they'll call them the nerdy type. I told you.
Is the natural law.
Wait, I have a question for you. Are you the clone? No, you're the original. You're the OG.
You worked out all the imperfections other than the B.
Of course. Yes.
You know, we studied natural law back many years ago. We were in law school.
Yeah.
It's a major controversy
Yeah.
because it was the title, the intellectual thought for so
Of
much
course.
of what
Of
went
course.
on in the echelons of law. Has there been any acceptance throughout the years that of the validity of natural law in jurisprudence and in the reality of your existence as to whether or not it's no longer, it should no longer be argument as to how important or valid natural law is.
Yes.
But is that still a controversy? Are there still people who vehemently reject it as not valid?
Yes.
And the next question I have is whether or not the natural law is associated with Catholicism
Right.
as opposed to a good thought, which
Right.
all other religions are to embrace.
Right.
And that's maybe one of the reasons why he didn't want to put God in it.
Right.
He wanted
Right.
everybody who was a rightful thinking person
Mhm.
who's searching for enlightenment, wherever it may be, would be sort of bogged down with the idea he was being challenged to accept Catholic form.
Yeah,
I think what was
okay. Let me try. First, today is the last class. Today is a day of revelations. It's the time for you to know that a couple of instances, it was the twin who came to class. Like when the other one had a deposition or something. So now you need to try to guess when this was, to delete everything you heard the day the twin came. Now to the question, I would say that the situation now, to your first question, as put by a famous professor, I don't remember now who it was, is now we are all natural lawyers. You know, fashions are irrelevant when it comes to what is true. And natural law was certainly out of fashion when it was still true. But the truth is that now the two roads have aligned, and so-called positivism is a very decadent view of law, that only what is written matters. That's the only thing that is relevant for a lawyer. Now we are almost in the opposite extreme. As one of my professors who teaches bankruptcy said to us in class when I was in law school last century, he said, you know, I don't know what the law is anymore. Now the law is you do like this and you try to see where the wind blows from, or you try to investigate who the judge is, if he went to Seton Hall or to Rutgers, if he had Ambrosio as a professor and things like that. The written rules, forget about it. You read them, but they won't tell you what you need to know. And there is a lot to be said for the truth of this. I'm not saying this is beautiful, but if this is true, then in law school, in every law school, not only in a Catholic law school like the ones they went to, do you know where they went to? Does anyone know? The twins, they would take turns, but both had to pay. They went to Catholic University of America, right?
The National Pontifical University.
Yeah, not like this one. Anyways, but if you go to Harvard today, in Harvard, they're about to hire a guy who is like one of the experts in natural law in the country. Because, now it's okay. Now it's legit. It's legit on the left. Of course, it's legit on the right. Now, many Christian colleges that are celebrating this presidency and so on, they hire people who do natural law, of course. Now, as for religion, I told them earlier that in this article I mentioned, there is a section where I try to distinguish natural law from religion because it is obvious that people will think that they are the same. If a guy who is called Saint Thomas Aquinas is the guy, and if Finnis, who was agnostic, converted to Catholicism, and to top it all, had 6 kids, well, it's very tempting to think there must be some connection between that religion, Catholic, and natural law, which is why I explain this book, Natural Law in Judaism, by Rabbi Novak. I explain how Islam comes into play. I explain how an agnostic can be a staunch defender of natural law, to the point to which I play with the idea that natural law is the religion of the atheist. Now, because everyone is an atheist these days, more or less, at least in my country.
But we should say that the concept of natural law started with the Stoics and the early Greeks, Plato and Aristotle. So ultimately, there's nothing religious at all about its origins.
I know.
And that John Cotton Murray, in the 1950s, wrote the importance of recognizing the secular nature of natural.
Oh, no, I know. The reason I mention it is only to bring to the park my uncle. I'm sure you all have that uncle, or maybe it's you, who is the typical person who is zero religious, never, ever went to church, but he's your model of right conduct. And you look up to this person. That's what I mean when I say natural law is the religion of those who don't have religion. Why? Because the rule that the honest, religious, faithful follows, this person also follows, even though he doesn't read the Bible, he doesn't care for it, he doesn't go to church, hence the play term for natural law.
Do you think that, like, Catholicism specifically is often compared to natural law as opposed to just like Christianity in general?
Yes, I would say so, but first let me tell you that, let me confess to you that I am a Catholic and I believe in miracles and I just seen one. Thank you. What's your name, miracle maker? Alina. You have to be called Alina. Spelled how? E-L-E?
E-L-E-N-A.
Are you a queen? Okay, oh, no, that's with an H. Helena. Yes, 100%. It's mostly like that for two reasons, I think. One has to do with Catholicism and one has to do with Protestantism. The one having to do with Catholicism is that not only a saint was the main developer, but if you read the documents of the church today, maybe you are familiar with a thick volume like this called the Catechism of the Catholic Church. You have pages and pages on natural law. So evidently someone will think, must be so. Now, the other reason is that in some non-Catholic, Christian, Protestant denominations, there is a profound aversion for natural law. Not in all of them, but in some that are very charismatic and that tend to prefer and depicting, not criticizing, irrational worship, where it is important that reason doesn't come into play. It's all about obedience. It's all about adherence to a will. Then, natural law has no room there because natural law, if you want to put it in a way a child would understand, checks God, tells you that God cannot be arbitrary.
Very good. That's very good.
We owe Elena. Yes, please.
So I know you mentioned the critics of Finnis said he was too distinct from Aquinas and, maybe had gone too far. To what extent do you think that criticism was valid? And if there are, I think this is something I struggle with too, finding any key distinction between Aquinas and Finnis.
I think at this late point in the class, it is important that we try to continue to find reasons to laugh. So I'll say that yours is a minor miracle because she opened the door. Just walk through, and I'll give you a little bit of credit too. What's your name?
Hunter?
Hunter. You know why I asked for your names, right? You can guess already. Points. Of course, participation points. I'm an enemy, a complete enemy. They invite fakeness. That's what they prompt about. These guys are the real thing. I think that to a large extent, they are absurd, those criticisms, because when you read what the critics say and they depict what is being criticized, you have a hard time distinguishing what they depict from the old text of Aquinas. And then, as Professor Ambrosio was saying to me, they say he's Kantian, but he's Kantian, Aquinas is Kantian too, because what they mean is he thinks there is a practical reason. Finnis does, of course, but so does Aquinas. Speculative. You're familiar with it. You strike me as the philosopher in the room.
Oh, no.
Thank you. I like your modesty.
I'd like to make an observation. I've been working on a case which there's no particular rule. I'm crafting a remedy based upon the failure of the insurance company to deal fairly and in good faith. That concept is very important these days because it's where all the non-statutory claims fall. Because if you can't find a particular statute or prohibition of certain conduct, which is ideal if you're trying to prove your case, you can fall back on the duty that everyone has to deal fairly and in good faith, which is ultimately the standards of natural law.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I've been dealing with that in a very intense way before I came here. That's what I worked on yesterday and today. So I just want to point out that what you're talking about and what you're studying is not esoteric, it's very practical. Because ultimately what you're learning in this class is the skill set that you're going to need to be the exceptional lawyer who goes beyond the rules to the real meaning of whether or not, even though there's no rule against it, there's something wrong with it because it wasn't fair, it wasn't in good faith. And all the principles that you're learning about the various tests of natural law fall into that discussion.
Elena, thank you for that. Do you know who is the senior of these two gentlemen?
Ambrosia's twin.
He's not. The senior.
Once again, I lost a lot of hair in that center.
Yes. The senior by 7 minutes just talked, and the reason I mention this is if someone is brought in, thank you. If someone is brought in like he was today, a senior, if a senior comes and says what he just said, which is, in other words, this class made sense, you need it, you'll get these kinds of things all the time, which is true, by the way, then you suspect he's being paid, for sure. But if he's the twin, that they are one and the same thing. So surely, I'm pretty sure these guys, they don't give money to each other at all. Now, this reality that has just been mentioned, we could call it the fact that there are many standards in the law now, many standards in commercial law. And so my professor, he would be very unhappy about, and maybe some of you are. But here, the question is not who is happy and who is unhappy about the uncertainty of the way the law is, but rather who is better prepared for this. You can cry and say, this shouldn't be so. I prefer a positivistic state of affairs, but the reality is it's no more. So whether you cry, whether you like it, you need it. I agree. And in fact, an idea occurred to me, which is very unrelated, but as this is the last class and we have them here, maybe we could take a picture, I'm going to, of all of us with them there so that you can keep it for the game, for the, like in the newspaper, the differences. Should we do that? What do you think? Yes. Do we have like an official photographer an associate professor here? Oh, we can, so that you can be in the picture. But first, let's take that question.
It's a little bit weird, but if you had to visualize,
If you want, sorry?
if you had to visualize the relationship between positives and natural law on a mathematical grid, would you consider them parallel lines, perpendicular lines, or would you consider them sitting on the same plane but on opposite sets of perspective? I know that's assuming you could.
Yes. In 4 words, I do not know. Because, you need to know many things to answer that question. I can only tell you that in one of my papers, I made a way less ambitious analogy that perhaps you, who know more about lines, can make it play in your favor. And that's the idea of whether you can compare the connection between natural law and natural rights with a glass, a recipient, and the liquid inside the glass. The recipient being positive law and the liquid being natural law. So I play with this idea and I explore the limits of such an analogy. Now yours may be very interesting too. You may want to press further.
All right. So I will, what does it get to start?
The third.
Third, what's today? Eighth. 21st. I'll be happy to, if you get a chance to go over those practices, questions, I'll be happy to meet with you and discuss your answers. So let's pick a time that's convenient. It should be soon.
Will you know their names when you mark their papers? You won't know?
It's anonymous. So I'll be happy to do that in the next week at this time. It's what day.
It's a Thursday schedule this Tuesday, though. Like there's classes going on a week from today
Yeah.
that are just not Thursday.
Okay,
That's why we don't have any more classes.
okay. So when would be a time to be?
I mean, do you guys have Thursday classes? So maybe we can do the same time.
Thursday. No, yeah, we're fine.
Well, it's a Thursday schedule.
Yeah, but I don't have, I think on Thursday, unless you're taking a class like this and only it's on Thursdays, I don't think any of us would have a class.
So
I think I can.
it's a week from today, at the same time.
Wait, let's do the picture.
Yeah, we gotta do the picture.
We'll do it there?
Yeah, we'll do it with,
Come, guys. I'll stick with it.
I can be the picture taker.
Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Let's go.
I've been, I'm really an actor.
Ask them outside.
Wanna go check?
Want me to tell you, he's wanting pizza from the church, you want to toss it outside?
He just loves sauces.
Come, guys, come. There are 3, 4 seats here.
I'll be a squatter. I'll do like this for.
We stand up. Okay, stand up.
I have an idea. Why don't we stand in front of that table?
No, this way.
This is great. No, this is good because people.
You're gonna have to watch it.
Here.
All guys get the lens. You know, one of my most cherished pictures, I had a 12-year-old son and we drove to the Supreme Court when I was going to be sworn in. And my son was with me and he was standing to the side, but the photographers said, no, go stand next to your father. So he was in the picture. Obviously not being sworn in, but it's one of my favorite pictures. What does he do?
Taking the pictures right now.
All right, this is good.
Data's cheap.
So we have what? Natural law.
Yeah, everyone say Finnis on 3. 1, 2, 3. All right.
Finnis means the end, by the way.
It's fitting.
With one end.
Did you know this?
Selfie.
Yeah, come.
Good. Here you are, that's it.
All right, so
Yeah, see this.
and Brian, let me thank you for your wonderful contribution.
So is this the final lecture? Oh. I'm gonna stay, I'm more.
Just ask, didn't teach you.
Yeah, that might be something that you want when I have you out. It's like something. Yeah, maybe looks.
Thanks, Tom.
But then she. But exactly what your mom's saying, is like, why would I?
Yeah, because these are things of things. We'll just.
Yeah.
Make it seem like it's just.
That's true.
Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, you're my classic. Blur. Oh, I'm just.
Could be the same.
Yeah.
Did you get the problem?
Yeah.
Yeah. Next week. Tuesday, we have some.
You don't, yeah, exactly, exactly. Right, me too. Yeah.
It's not good. Thank you so much. No, just because. No, thank you. Yeah, I'm actually, I'm associated for a while, so I yes.
My dad went to the with
Yes, it's on recording. I do have a question for you. Yeah, we should definitely talk, because this is something I want to expand in the next year. So I guess my question would be coming at a different angle. Are there any differences between RAS? I would say not much. And so, you know, wow. Well, that's, although he is a believer.
He calls himself a prosecutor.
Yes.
Which Finnis could call himself that too. Now, Finnis wants to be a
When we correspond, I'll send you something on that, that I think you find perhaps interesting, and we can take it from there.
Sure, yeah, that'd be great, thank you.
So I'll write you an email.
Yeah, please do.
Awesome.
Please do, and I'll send you this file once I
Please
figure out
do.
how to do it.
Please.
In fact, I'm gonna stop the recording.
Right. Pleasure meeting you again.
Exactly, what are you guys heading off to do, grab lunch or something?
Yeah, we're gonna go. What time we have for this?
Where are you going?
No.
Nearby.
It's closed.